Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 10, Day 6. Today's journal, what were some things that were going on at home, that's the United States, during the Second World War? I'd like for you to take and go back and review your Day 5 notes, write a paragraph of 4 to 5 sentences. All right, today we're going to be starting Unit 10, Day 6, the Pacific Theater. And when I say the Pacific Theater, I'm talking about in the Pacific Ocean where they're going to be fighting the Japanese military. Now, what was the American approach to the war in Japan? That's kind of going to be our focus for the day. Now, our first approach is one that is not one to be proud of, and that was the Japanese internment camps. Somewhere between 110,000 to 120,000 Japanese people were subject to this mass exclusion program that was developed. And essentially what we tried to do was put Japanese people into these camps to keep them from being secret agents or spies or whatever you want to call them during World War II. Now, most of the people, roughly about 2/3, were already U.S. citizens that were of Japanese ancestry. So we were putting U.S. citizens into these internment camps, and they weren't good places to live either. In February of 1942, FDR gave in to pressure and signed an order allowing the War Department to declare any part of the U.S. as a military zone and to remove anybody they wanted from that zone. So essentially, this allowed the U.S. government to not enslave, but basically imprison people without cause or any kind of justification. Now, the camp conditions were not good. They were told these Japanese people to only bring the necessities, sell everything else that they had. Some were unprepared for the harsh conditions. Obviously, most were, because who knew it was going to be like it was. These camps had no indoor plumbing, cooking facilities. It was very cramped, and the camps were surrounded by barbed wire, so you couldn't even, like, it just felt like a prison. I mean, you were essentially in prison if you were one of these Japanese Americans. Some Japanese American citizens even died trying to leave the premises, trying to get out. It just was a rough situation, because if you try to escape, they think you're a spy. If you stay there, you're living in these horrible conditions. I've got a bunch of pictures of just people heading towards the internment camps. Here's a look at a Japanese family preparing to go into the internment camp. Here's one of the places where they were staying in the internment camps. Okay, as you can see, not a lot of living space, very, very small quarters. Here's a group of people that are waiting in line to be checked into the internment camp. Groups of people at the Japanese internment camp. All right, and here is some of the stereotypical information that they put out, trying to show the difference between Chinese people and Japanese people. Obviously, at this time, Chinese people were being helped by the United States to try to fight the Japanese. And so, I mean, you can look through some of these things, very, very racist in some ways, the way they tried to describe Japanese people versus Chinese. These are some of the political cartoons encouraging people not to take days off, but to work, and that we needed every bit of production that we could get in order to defeat the Japanese people. There was also anti-Nazi campaigns. You know, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today, unless we keep on firing. So on both sides of the country, whether it was, you know, the East Coast, West Coast, wherever it may be, they're trying to promote, you know, doing your part to try to save the country, to fight against the Japanese, to fight against, you know, the groups of people that are attacking us or have declared war on us. Now, one of the most important battles of World War II for the United States in the Pacific was Midway. And it's considered a turning point for the Allied forces with Japan, mainly because the Japanese had wanted Midway as a supply base, but the U.S. military had learned of the attack and basically had kind of planned their own secret attack on Japan. And so Japan was loaded out to attack the base and the island, but they didn't realize that there was a whole fleet of ships. And in the Japanese eyes, attacking the fleet was more important than taking the island, because if they could cripple the fleet, that would help their war effort for years if the war went on that long. Unfortunately, while they were trying to switch out from land to sea, like basically bombs and torpedoes, the American planes caught the carriers with fuel and bombs on the flight deck. And when they bombed them, this reduced the aircraft carriers to rubble. They were essentially just destroyed immediately. This forced the Japanese retreat, mainly because they had lost the heart of their fleet. And you can see how destructive this battle was. 362 Americans died versus 3,057 Japanese. And Midway was a tiny island, but after the attack, the Japanese had lost as bad at Midway as the United States had lost at Pearl Harbor. So it was a very important battle. Now, we come to island hopping, which was just an attempt to capture an island close enough to bomb Japan. And essentially what we wanted to try to do was get to a place where all of our planes could launch and attack Japan directly. Iwo Jima was our first, one of the first islands that we came to after Midway as we continued to push through the Pacific. 750 miles from Japan, we spent 2 months fighting, which claimed over 7,000 American lives, but claimed over 20,000 Japanese lives. All but 1,000 Japanese people fought to the death. They refused to surrender, even in smaller numbers. Okinawa was the next island, which was about 350 miles from Japan. And from April to June of 1945, we fought there as well, claiming 12,000 American lives versus 100,000 Japanese lives. And it's important to note that these Japanese people were so desperate and so determined not to surrender that many of the people who were just regular people killed themselves to avoid being captured by Americans. The other important group here is the kamikaze fighters, and that was the name for Japanese pilots. And these kamikaze fighters were not afraid to take their plane and crash it into an American ship or a group of American soldiers just to make sure that they did their part. They were willing to sacrifice their lives, which made the Americans believe that they would rather die than surrender and that they were desperate. Here you can see kind of the way we took our approach into Japan, as well as trying to get into the backside of Japan. One of the things that's going to help us is by pushing to the south into Okinawa and the lower parts of Japan. It was going to allow us to gain the support of Russia coming from the other side. The problem is, and we'll see this as we get to the 1950s, is by enlisting the Russian support, there's going to be a kind of a issue of who's in control of certain land, but we'll get to that. Here you can see the American soldiers at Iwo Jima, one of the most famous pictures of men putting up the American flag. There's still a statue of this today at Iwo Jima. One of the things that was always a kind of like a weird thing about these pictures is there's like an extra hand, and I can't remember where it's at in the picture, but essentially it's like there's like an extra hand that doesn't make sense that it's there, but somehow it's helping put up the flag, and so it's supposed to be kind of like some divine thing that America was winning the war. Here you can see Okinawa is ours after 82 days. And if you look down there at the picture, you can see kind of it gives a radius of how far it is to various places that we would need to get to after taking Okinawa, which is going to be very important to our attacks in the Pacific. Now, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were going to be two of the cities that we attacked, and we were threatening Japan with prompt and utter destruction if they did not surrender, which they would not. And on August 6th of 1945, the plane known as the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. And Hiroshima was an important industrial city, killing roughly about 120,000 people, 80 to 120,000 people instantly, and others dying from burns and radiation sickness later. Roughly about 63% of the city was destroyed, and the pure chaos of these bombs is hard to imagine. On August 9th of 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, and on the same day, the U.S. dropped another bomb on the city, known as Fat Man, killing between 35 and 74,000 people. Because of this massive destruction and everything going on, the Soviet Union entering the war, and the United States dropping the atomic bomb, Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945, known as VJ Day. All right, so here is your vocabulary. Please get these words down, and please let me know if you have any problems. If not, I'll talk